Hey, soulmates, what's going on? I thought that today would be a nice time to start something a little new and different, and something I think is going to be very exciting. Thought we'd talk about, instead of me talking about paintings I've done and stuff, I thought we'd talk about very famous paintings by very famous artists. And the first one I really want to talk about today is, well, Vincent Van Gogh and his most famous piece, Starry Night. Now, Vincent van Gogh, he painted a lot of paintings in a very short period of time. He was only active for maybe the last decade of his life. I think he was only active for about 8 years or so. So he made up a lot of time in a very short period of time. And up to that point, he hadn't really painted a lot. So what he was doing was he was really just making up for lost time. He was painting as fast as he could. And well, the thing about Starry Night, let's go into the details about this one. Starry Night was painted at a time when Vincent van Gogh had very recently had a mental breakdown after his friendship with Paul Gauguin had ended. It's not clear the details of why exactly the relationship ended the way it did. What happened was that Gauguin and Van Gogh were not getting along, and that night after Gauguin had left, Vincent van Gogh sliced off his left ear, or at least part of it. The accounts vary, but it's generally accepted that he just cut off part of his left earlobe. So that's pretty gnarly. Vincent van Gogh was not in a good place here. He didn't have any companionship hardly aside from correspondence with his brother Theo, who was supporting him financially. He was giving Vincent money for paint, and he was also giving Vincent money for food and rent and such. Vincent didn't really make any money selling art. He got all of his support from Theo, who was an art dealer and a very successful one at that. And ironically, Vincent was a pretty successful art dealer himself before he decided to leave the profession and, well, first become a clergyman, and then he decided to become an artist. Well, let's look at Starry Night. And Starry Night here was painted in very early summer of 1889. And it was painted while he was voluntarily staying at an asylum shortly after his mental breakdown while he was staying with Gauguin. Funny enough, Gauguin and him both corresponded with each other up until Van Gogh's death. And in fact, they were planning on reforming a sort of an artist colony like they originally planned on, even though obviously that didn't work out. Well, Starry Night here is. It's actually a really unusual painting for Van Gogh because Van Gogh wasn't the sort who painted from imagination very often. While he would do a lot of cartoon type stuff and he would go nuts with the depiction of what he was painting, what he was really doing was he was kind of doing a cartoon version of reality whenever he would paint pictures. But when we look at Starry Night here, we see some very interesting things going on. We see his imagination on display. We see the stars in the sky absolutely shimmering with this pointillism technique that he picked up from, well, the pointillist. Van Gogh was very, very heavily influenced by the Impressionists and the pointillists. Pointillism at the time, you have to remember, was extremely in vogue. It was very popular at the time, and it was the thing right after Impressionism, and Impressionism was still very popular too. Impressionism and Pointillism were both rampant in art at the time, so Vincent adopted both of them because his brother Theo advised him, well, if you want to sell some paintings, Vincent, you should probably start looking at these modern painters here because they're doing very well. One of the interesting things about Vincent was that he originally started with a very muted palette, and he was starting with very different style of painting than what he would do later. It still looked like it was very much an impressionist style, but it also had a flavor of Dutch painting about it, which would, well, make sense because Vincent van Gogh is Dutch himself. So obviously there's going to be the influence of Dutch art upon him. That's just a given based on where he's from. Well, Vincent, I think, reached the height of what he was capable of with maybe not this painting, but definitely his later work. Funny enough, I don't think Starry Night is his best work of all the later stuff that he's done. But that's regardless here. Let's look at the painting itself and note the swirling depiction of the wind. I'm honestly not sure if that's supposed to be the wind or if it's supposed to be clouds, but either or, it's fascinating to look at it. And the mountain range in the background, everything looks so fantastic. It looks like it's a depiction of a fantasy land for a storybook of some sort when you really look at it this way. Vincent, his palette was entirely provided for by his brother, and Vincent did extensive research into all the colors available at the time. If you look at notes between him and his brother saved pretty much every letter that he ever wrote to him, whereas Vincent didn't really save any of Theo's letters. There are a handful that survive, but most of the correspondence between Theo and Vincent is from Vincent. And to Theo's credit, a lot of those letters survived, and you can actually find them online. You can find them in books at the library or wherever. They've been published multiple times. And they're kind of a fascinating read because it provides a lot of insight into the artist's mind here that you really don't get anywhere else. From the early part of his career all the way to very close to his death. One of the notable things about the painting here is even though the sky looks very fantastic, very fantasy-like, and well, just shimmering with light, despite the night sky, the town that's depicted beneath the sky there in the mountain range is actually, I think it's completely fabricated. If you really look at the painting, if you really look at it up close, it's kind of hard to get a sense of any light sources on all the buildings that are depicted below. If you look at the trees that are also swirling with that pointless technique that he loved to employ, and that pointless technique that he loved to employ was very much something that was unique to him. Because even though that he did something that was kind of the trademark of the pointless didn't really do swirling movement like this. The pointless did more uniform dots of paint and daubs of paint, like Signac and wow, the name of the artist who painted Sunday Afternoon is escaping me at the moment, but he's one of the most famous pointillists of all. Well, sometimes you forget artists when you're talking about them, but it's just something that happens to me sometimes. Well, anyway, the point is, Van Gogh took this pointless technique and he made it his own because he adopted it to create this feeling of movement that you get in pretty much all of his pieces from his years forward after he adopted modern painting techniques and a modern palette. You can really see that he made perfect use of, it looks like a lot of ultramarine here, and I'd say Prussian blue. If he didn't use ultramarine, he definitely used cobalt blue. It's one of those two. It's really hard to make heads or tails of what exactly he was using, but I'm pretty sure he was using Prussian blue and a French ultramarine or a cobalt blue for the violet tones in there, whereas the darker paints I suspect are probably Prussian blue, especially in the mountains. The mountains look especially like Prussian blue, but the sky might be French ultramarine. And then the yellows that he always used chrome yellow in his later years, and I don't know why, because Theo was providing his colors for him. So it seems odd that he would choose a chrome yellow when he could have asked Theo for a cadmium yellow. And maybe it was a stylistic choice, or maybe he just felt bad about the expense that Theo had to go to provide him with all of his colors. And so maybe he asked Theo for a cheaper yellow to make it a little easier on his bank book. Well, I don't know what the case is, but even if he was using this yellow that eventually turned brown because chrome yellow, it would eventually turn brown. It's one of those colors that wasn't very sturdy at the time, and even so, Van Gogh used it. It's got a kind of mustardy tone to it, the chrome yellow does. It's an interesting color to look at. It's not as bright as the cadmium yellows. The cadmium yellows are a lot brighter when set next to a chrome yellow. Chrome yellows later on were made a little more effectively with an encapsulated version where they would put the pigment in a sort of a plastic or silicone, or I'm not even sure what they encapsulated in, but it made the color more permanent. And there were a few independent tests out there that show the chrome yellow with the encapsulated version, and it held up as well as you would expect it to after the fact. It just needed that little bit extra protection. But unfortunately, Van Gogh didn't have that back in the late 1880s. So what you see here is what survives of the yellow. And it doesn't look like the shot of it has turned too horribly brown, which is thankful. So we still have some idea of what the color was supposed to be. One of the more unfortunate things about Vincent's palette is that some of the colors that he did use would tend to fade, a lot like J.M.W. Turner's paintings. But that's not quite as bad in Vincent's work, because you really have to keep in mind that the colors that he used were really some of the ones that were the best available at the time. They didn't have a cadmium red at the time, they had vermilion. So he had to use vermilion, even though it would turn brown. And vermilion was an orange red to red color that was very opaque and was pretty much the cadmium red color of its day. Everybody used it. So you either used vermilion for your orange red at the time, or you used nothing. Or else you just found another color to use, pretty much. Everybody used vermilion. Everybody. And then the other color that was available for more pinkish reds and such was alizarin crimson. And alizarin crimson was a very new color at the time still. It was only about 15 to 20 years old when Vincent started using it. And it was considered a suitable replacement for rose madder, which was thought to be extremely fugitive. And alizarin crimson has its own set of problems, and in some of Vincent's paintings, the alizarin crimson is faded. But it's hard to blame him for that, because it's really the best he had available to him. It's either those two colors to use as his reds, or else he was using earth colors. And well, it's just a fact of life, I guess you could say. I don't know about the swirling tree in the foreground here. It's not something that I particularly like to look at. It looks like it's unfinished. This tree that you see in the left portion of the painting that's just swirling and rising up like tentacles rising from the ground. It's almost like it's a fire. Like it's thinking. Like it's trying to hold itself firm against the wind. The vibe I get here is that the wind is blowing, judging by the way that the wind is swirling in the sky, or the marks of the swirling sky here, and the swirling marks of the trees over in the near the mountain range in the background, close to the town. All those trees, you can see the highlights on them, which suggests that Vincent had some sense of light sources, which is, a good thing in an artist. But was it necessarily a strong indicator of light source throughout the entire painting? No, I don't think that Vincent had strong indications of light sources. It looks like he's struggling in some sense. I don't know what his frame of mind here was, because he wasn't doing well, but while he was in the asylum, he would go around and paint pictures. And he would still paint all things like this, like we can see. There's only a few pictures I can think of. Right now, one other one comes to mind that where he painted from his imagination, quite like this. Again, it's very unusual that Vincent would paint from his imagination like this. Usually he would paint from life, even if he would make cartoon versions of life with outlines and swirling marks and exaggerated figures and architecture and all this. This is a very unusual picture for Vincent. It's considered his most famous work. You can see the canvas the bare canvas where he didn't paint everything completely. I'm uncertain, honestly, if this is because he didn't paint the canvas or whether it flaked off because he might have painted with a zinc white. But also, it looks like there's a bit of yellowing to the whites here. So he might have just painted with lead white, or else he might have painted with a combination of the two. Lead white will cause paint to delaminate too over time, but it's a long-term effect and not a short-term one like zinc white is. So it's hard to say. Maybe Vincent just neglected to finish the entire painting. Maybe he just didn't feel inclined to paint every part of the canvas. And this is kind of a common thing among impressionists, I think, and also among pointillists, that this sort of unfinished look to the painting would be present. It also kind of makes me believe that the swirling tree, he didn't finish it and it just left it as is. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he felt that he had accomplished what he set out to do. It's hard to say what Vincent's mindset here was. It does provide me with a emotional impact because it makes me think that the town is half asleep, but they're also preparing for something dreadful. It feels like something awful is going to happen when you look at this painting, doesn't it? Vincent actually painted multiple versions of this particular scene that he was looking at through his bedroom window. And what's really funny about the way that he was painting through his bedroom window when he painted these pictures, and this picture also, is that his window was barred, so he had a very limited view of what he could see without struggling a little bit to look out the window. And each of the pictures that he painted, except for this one, the most famous one, were all painted during the daytime, and you can see details very clearly in all of them. And if you look at the landscapes that he did paint of the ones during the day, you can see that the landscapes are a lot more sparse, and they don't have anywhere near as many fantastical elements. You see more fields and fewer houses and fewer spires, all that. Also, his palette appears to be less intense in some areas. Still, you can spot the swirling tree in one of the paintings, which is entitled Green Wheat Field with Cypress. So I think that the cypress is what he was depicting in Starry Night. And Starry Night was the only one that he painted during the night. And funny enough, it turned out to be his most famous painting in the end. Sometimes I wonder how Vincent would have felt about that, and how Vincent would have felt about his fame if he had, well, lived long enough to see it. It's interesting to think about things like that, but it's also just conjecture and thought. I guess it's no surprise that Vincent did multiple versions of this landscape where the final product was Starry Night. He liked to work in series a lot like the Impressionists, and he did take a lot of inspiration, as I say, from the Impressionists. He met Claude Monet. He knew several of them, and I believe they liked his work, but I can't really say with certainty whether they liked his work. I know that he was great friends with the Pointillists, and Signac in particular was a good friend of his, as was Toulouse-Lautrec. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Toulouse-Lautrec? Yeah, something like that. My French is kind of iffy, so forgive me if I'm not pronouncing that quite right. But they were both good friends with Van Gogh, and they wouldn't let anyone speak bad of him. There's an illustration that Van Gogh did after he painted Starry Night called Cypresses in Starry Night, where he kind of just imitates the composition that he did of Starry Night, so it's very, very similar. But also the cypress that he painted is more detailed. There's a better sense of form in this, whereas in the actual painting, the form of the cypress is really lost, and all you can see is that very dark mass in the foreground, which is So unfortunate, because I think that if Vincent had spent a little bit more time on this painting, it would be just that much better. And you see this flash of brilliance, this flash of greatness in the painting, where it's almost perfect. And I feel like, I don't know if it's going to be a very popular thing to say, but I feel like the cypress is really holding the painting back. Even so, it's hard to argue with the emotional impact of the painting and the fact that Vincent's breakdown has contributed to something that has seeped through into his work here. Every so often, a painting like this would come out of Van Gogh, where you would see these fantastic things, and then he would go back to his regular work, where it looked a little bit more conventional, or as conventional as Van Gogh was. It's a very exciting painting, that's for very certain, and I'm quite fond of the illustration of it. I just wish that Vincent had gone back and painted it a little more. I think he only painted it in maybe one session. I have a feeling that he only painted it in one session, and that's why it looks the way it does. Anyway, really hope you enjoy this first edition of looking at an artist's work and just thinking about it and talking about it and really getting a feel for what we can expect from artists like this. As I say, this is completely out of the ordinary for Van Gogh's body of work, because he didn't usually paint from imagination, he would paint from life. And he was very much a stickler about that, so the fact that he did so many things from imagination in this painting is kind of remarkable. There's only one other painting where he did that, and the name escapes me right now, but Gauguin was very much encouraging him to paint from his imagination. And I think that's part of the reason that they didn't get along so well, is that they would have arguments about it. And it kind of strikes me as fantastic that they would have arguments about painting from life versus painting from imagination. And I don't know why they cared. Why couldn't they just each do their own thing? It seems needless that they would have had such a falling out like they did. But they did, and it's history. Well, I want to thank you for watching and for listening, and I really hope you enjoyed this. And if you want to see more, be sure that you hit the like button and subscribe today, because I would love to have you. Be sure you check out my painting vlog, and also check out my ASMR painting series, where I talk about and I paint paintings, well, within a time frame of about a couple of hours. That's what the ASMR painting series is, and the painting vlog series is just me just sitting back, chilling, and talking some more while I paint some more. But those are a little bit more serious works, where I'm just painting them bit by bit, whereas ASMR painting is painting an entire painting within a 2-hour time frame. So some of those are just products of what the limitations are, if you know what I mean. Anyway, I'll see you again soon. Next time on this little talking about paintings show that we've got here. I don't really have a name for it, but next time we're going to talk about Monet's Woman with a Parasol, one of his most famous paintings. I figured that it'd be good to start with a couple of the more famous paintings out there, and I thought that it'd be nice to talk about some artists that I think you guys are going to like, because I know lots of people like Van Gogh, lots of people like Monet, or I should say Impressionism in general. So it just seems natural that we're going to talk about Van Gogh and Monet right off the bat. So next time, look for Woman with a Parasol, and I'll be back then. Until then, with love from me to you. Bye-bye.